Don, I probably know, remotely more about your history than most people I have on here because I have read you for so long now. But even in going back and just kind of looking at the history that the media depicts of you, it was interesting. I've realized I have a lot of questions. So thanks for coming here because you've had such an interesting trajectory of your motives, of the reasons for
Yeah.
what you've done. But when I go back, if you look even in Wikipedia, I'm always curious what they post about people there. And it starts off with you at 21. Miller left his home in Texas, went to Portland, Oregon, where he owned a small Portland-based textbook publishing company called Coffee House Books. And you published your first book at 21. I mean, prior to that, what were you, in your childhood, even what were the going through high school, whatever it was, what were the motives? Were there any specific pursuits that you had, or do you
Yeah.
find yourself just meandering at the time?
Well, it was a lot of meandering, of course, in
Well,
your teens and early
such as all of
20s.
us. Yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, it was just survival. It was just, trying to stay alive during high school. I was an overweight kid. Uh, was bullied a little bit. Looking back, I probably could have been bullied a lot more. So
Yeah.
somehow I developed some survival mechanisms there, uh, and then was grateful to kind of get out of high school and start traveling. A buddy of mine and I jumped in a Volkswagen camping van, and I think I watched my friends go off to college, and I felt like they were all leaving to go start a professional life. Um, my grades were so bad in high school, and I just wasn't an attentive student that I just kind of became a little bit of a wanderer vagabond for a while. So I think my motives early on, before I ever wrote a book, were just to explore and to break free from my home and from the lack of performance that I produced in high school and all that. And just like so many people, went off to find myself, and it was in that exploration that I began to really be interested in becoming a writer. I started reading a lot of books, memorizing a lot of poetry, and began to hone my skill just as a writer, which took another, I mean, it had to have taken 7 or 8 years of just trying to write something before I ended up starting to work on a book.
Was the school just a lack of interest in it?
Yeah, it was a lot of things. It was a victim mentality that I developed as a survival mechanism, and some of it was easy to develop because Dad left when I was a kid. We grew up in basically poverty. Stood in line in the welfare line. And I remember standing in line for government cheese. The only reason my mom was able to afford a house was because of a special piece of legislation that allowed people who didn't have a down payment to.
Hmm.
I think we paid $35,000 for our home,
Wow.
and so and mom worked till 6, 7 o'clock at night. We were latchkey kids. Came home and had a key tied around our neck all the way from elementary school, all the way through high school. And so there wasn't a massive support network that would help me develop some of the discipline that I needed. On top of that, I was I was willingly lazy and distracted. So,
Well, and you say that, and when you at some point go off to find yourself,
yeah.
a lot of people in your situation never have. Was
Mm.
there anybody you were exposed to, anything you were exposed to that gave you just that hint of desire? Back when I used to consult and coach people kind of in the personal development space, I had a couple guys in particular who grew up in bad situations and they didn't really know what they wanted. They just had some hint of there's got to be something more. And I was curious,
Yeah.
with them, because a lot of people, as you know, never really even come to that point and they just exist throughout life. Do you look back and say, gosh, maybe this was a piece of that exposed me to thinking there could be more and I had a desire for that?
100%. As much as hard as my mother worked and as late as she worked, and she was a pretty incredible woman, and I got to tell you, I had a great childhood. I mean, I have extremely fond memories. My mother would take us to the theater, and we'd go see plays. She any free ticket she could get, we'd be there. She was always the mother who stuffed popcorn in her purse and had contraband,
Yeah.
going into the baseball
God
game.
bless her for that.
But she would, the big thing for me is she found this plaque I mean, it was really a certificate in a cheap frame. Uh, and it had the meaning of your name. And so, my
Mm.
name is Donald Lewis Miller. And underneath that, it said the meaning of my name, which was fearless leader. So the whole time I'm growing up, I've got a plaque on my wall that has the meaning of my name, which is
Mm.
fearless leader. And of course, now I have no idea where that came from. That I don't know where people get the meanings of their names or whatever. But as a kid, I believed it.
Yeah.
And I would look up at that and I would wonder, I mean, I'm talking about years. I wonder when I'm going to become that. But I was naive enough to believe that that was a sure thing. And that's who you are and who you're going to become, even though I was scared to death that somebody was going to beat me up at school. There was no fearlessness in me. So I think when I went off, that subconscious idea got planted in my brain. And then when I went off to find myself, there was a feeling of, and I know this sounds narcissistic and arrogant, but there was a feeling of, yes, I'm going out to find myself, but if I could stand outside myself for a minute, somebody really who's going to become really special someday is going off to find themselves. And I don't exactly know how that's going to develop itself within me, but it's going to, because that's what this plaque that my mother bought at Walgreens said on the
That's
wall. So essentially, I got tricked into thinking I could be successful, and then I'm glad I got tricked.
that's
Now,
interesting as a parent to to
sure,
consider
yeah, it
that
really is.
power and whether it's true or not. You mentioned your mom drawing or taking you to movies, and obviously lots of kids grow up watching stuff, but obviously that became a significant part of your story
Hmm.
later on in regards to story. Did you
Well,
have
no,
that,
yeah.
even that? Because I was going to ask, so what drew you to writing? And I remember from an earlier show, you talked about getting a writing gig with from a youth pastor for a local publication or something like
Right.
that. But
Yeah.
still, where was movies, writing, where did that, was there a catalyst, a specific thing that drew you to that? And was it just it was a creative outlet? You wanted to impart something? Or I know part of your story too, which I understand is just wanting the affirmation that you thought you might get from it.
Yeah, I was a member of the band in my high school, my honestly my junior high and middle school and high school, the whole thing. And I was not very good, but there was a season in my senior year where I just went through a phase where I really developed very good habits in terms of practicing my instrument, and even went to 1 semester of college on a music scholarship, if you can believe it.
Oh, wow.
And I fell in love with this idea of composing music that would move people. And
Mm.
then my youth pastor gave me a chance to write the guest observation. So the observation was the editorial in his weekly newsletter that they made on the Xerox machine at church. And he gave me a chance to write a guest observation, and I did so. And probably it was actually a review of the high school talent show. And about 7 or 8 people at church the next Sunday came up to me and said, "Hey, I read your article. It's really good. You're a really good writer." And of course, now I know that they're just being kind to the youth group kid who had the guest column. But I mean, I really felt like I discovered part of why I was going to be a fearless leader someday. It was going to be through the written word. And that itch that I was trying to scratch composing music, I realized you could do the same thing composing pieces of literature. And then right after high school, another youth pastor asked me to come in and speak at their weekend youth retreat. And then I discovered that I really liked composing those experiences, not only with written word, but in as a public speaker. And so as I left Texas and traveled around the country to go find myself, the idea that I could write words and move people had been planted strong
Yeah.
enough. Then the other thing that happened was my mom sent me to a camp called Summit Ministries, and at the time it was a very conservative, uh, you know, defending sort of conservative Republican views on everything. It was a way to get your kids to become really strong Republicans, is what it
Wow.
was. I mean, there were 3-hour lectures on why we should have won Vietnam. I mean, it was just the most absurd kind of, a lot of good stuff with absurd stuff. But one thing they taught us at that place, at that camp, that youth camp, it was an academic youth camp. So you'd spend 8 hours a day in lectures. It wasn't like a sports camp. It was
Yeah.
a lecture camp. But they taught us that the country was ours, that we were responsible to lead it, that leaders are readers. They taught us about a worldview. And so much of what they taught has now gone by the wayside to me because of its relative absurdity. Um, but at the same time, they taught me to read, and they taught me that leadership was on us, and I really took that to heart. And I'm very grateful for that camp experience, because if you combine, you know, writing a guest observation and people coming up saying you're a good writer, speaking and having people come up and say you're a good speaker, and then this mantle of leadership that was given to us at this camp, all of it absorbed into me through some naivete and probably some desperate need for affirmation, but it worked. And I began reading ferociously, and memorizing a lot of poetry. And then about 5 years after that, I tried to write books before. About 5 years after that, I sat down at Common Ground Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, on Hawthorne Street, and wrote a paragraph that I wanted to be the beginning of a book. And I knew at the end of that paragraph, this was going to go all the way, that this paragraph would continue all the way to the end of the book. And it did. And that was a book about traveling around the country in a Volkswagen that's now called Through Painted Deserts.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my first book. And that book didn't sell very well. The next book sold really, really well. But then after that, I'm not by no means a fearless leader, but I own the idea that my words could be influential and we could take the world to a better place. And
Did you ever consider a different career path, or was writing, let's say composing, which covered, a couple possible genres, a few possible genres? Was there a point where you said, this is where I'm going to stick?
Well, at first it was, I got a job at a publishing company, and I ended up running that company. And then I started my own company, and then I wrote my first book.
Mm-hmm.
So I really enjoyed business, and I saw myself much more as being an executive at a big publishing company than a writer. And then even after writing my first book, which only sold like 10,000 copies, I still saw myself as more an executive at a publishing company. That's where my career was going to go. And then it wasn't until my second book took off and ultimately sold so many copies that there was just no way I could do both.
Yeah.
That I decided to double and triple down on the writing.
Where did the faith aspect come in? Because as you get into Blue Like Jazz and then Searching for God Knows What was the background that motivated you along that communicating about spirituality?
Well, I wrote in a memoir style and with a memoir voice. And so having grown up in a Baptist church in Texas, and then being a person of very strong faith, a lover of Jesus, if you will. And then I audited classes and spent time at Reed College, which was the most godless campus in the country. And the average IQ was 2 points above genius. It was a very unique place to be a Christian. I didn't attend school there, but I hung out with the Campus Crusade group, which was very small. And we had this kind of little Christian Bible study on campus. And I was one of the leaders of that. So the contrast of the way I grew up versus all these incredibly intelligent agnostics and atheists who I really liked and admired, that became a very interesting story to write about. And so when I wrote Blue Like Jazz, I was writing about that particular intersection of a very, what I now know is a very Southern American version of Christianity, not to be confused with the incredible depth of what the Bible's presenting. I mean, I grew up in a church that taught the Bible, loved the Bible, and taught that Black men shouldn't date white women. That was just one of the paramount ideas that the Bible supposedly taught. So you're talking about a really perverted version of Christianity.
Well, and that's I grew up in the same Southern Baptist in Tennessee and Kentucky, And so I'm sure that's why your books were always of special interest to me in regards to that. So when you look at that, look at Blue Like Jazz and look at Searching for God Knows What, I remember back then in reading you, I said, yeah, the guy's a Christian, but kind of a dangerous type Christian. You may not want him to, you might not have him at your church, on Sunday at the pulpit. What, looking back then, was was it just to share your thoughts? Was there a motive to it? It may be an overlap of multiples. Was it to somewhat shine a light on this perverted religion that you saw and help, free people from that to something better? I mean, again, curious about the motives back then. What was
Well,
it?
the motives for me were the absolute enjoyment of using words to compose an experience, and borrowing from my own life, that was going to be a Christian experience, or there's going to be Christian overtones to it, very strong Christian overtones to it.
So the experience was an
And so
even
the motive was not to teach people religion. It really wasn't. The motive was I enjoyed the actual composition of writing the words and guiding people through, hopefully, an entertaining, restful, provocative, literary beach read. Right, that's what I was looking for, and I was genuinely surprised at that Blue Like Jazz was a controversial book.
Hmm.
But of course, then I have to go back to, when you go from, a small town in South Texas to the most godless campus in the country, you're really fast forwarding about 75 years of culture. And uh, I had been in that environment so long that when I wrote the book, and it went back 75 years, and people just thought this was moving too fast. The idea that Jesus might not be a Republican was an incredibly controversial thought to a lot of people. That he is not with your party, and it still is. I mean, it's
Sure.
it still is in pockets of America. So, but I had no idea when I was writing it that I was pushing any sort of envelope. I really could have been writing fiction about a lost dog looking for its owner and had the same pleasure.
Did you not get pushback from your publisher, in
No,
regards? Really?
no, not
Which
at
was,
all.
which I'm looking to hear was Nelson, was so Thomas Nelson.
Yeah,
So
it's a conservative publisher.
sure.
Now, I think Lifeway put a warning label on my books, and then somebody else banned the books. Occasionally I'd get asked to speak at like a mega church, and then get called like 2 weeks later, and they would say, "We're going to have to, you know,
There,
some
there,
of our board members are not happy with the
that was
fact
my
that we
view
got
of
you."
you back then. There you go. That sums it up.
I'd get
Uh,
that, and I was, it was always just, it didn't really ever offend me or hurt my feelings. Portland is a very isolated place, and there are not very many Christians there, so people didn't recognize me. The internet was not a thing that you could go on and read blogs about yourself, or I just hear, yeah, some guy in Kentucky doesn't want me to speak at his church, and I'd kind of spend about 5 minutes wondering why, and then just lose interest, because it wasn't my culture. It didn't affect the people who were around me.
well, so you go through here and you have, of course, great success with Blue Like Jazz. You've got Searching for God Knows What, Through Painted Deserts, which is the redo of your first book,
Right. Yeah.
To Own a Dragon. And I'm going to lead up to A Million Miles in 1,000 Years, somewhere in there. And I know that there were some issues around this, but I read at one time in his life, Miller weighed nearly 400 pounds and wore size 50 pants. When was that?
That's so hard to
Like
even believe
timeline.
that that's true. That's a good question.
I'm just
It was after Blue Like Jazz.
okay. So so you're having great success vocationally.
I'm having success vocationally. But again, it would take me 2 to 3 years to release a book, where now it takes me one. So things are obviously, I'm more disciplined and more organized now. But there was just there was a season there, and I'd come in and out of it. I always have been a binge eater, even to this day. Even though I don't gain weight or anything like that, I still feel like there's like once every couple months or something, I literally think, boy, I could just turn on the TV and eat a gallon of ice cream right now. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? That's still in
Yes, I
me.
do. Yeah.
And as it is in a lot of people. But at that time I was giving into it all the time. I mean, all the time. I really just didn't know any other way. Uh, I didn't believe I had the discipline to not do that.
So it
So
wasn't a medication necessarily you
sure,
look
I
back
think,
on
yeah, sure. I think it was. Yeah, I think I was numbing myself and
from,
avoiding who knows what. I mean, I had to do a lot of work. I saw a couple therapists, went to on-site workshops, which is a therapeutic retreat center.
yeah,
There
we
was
had Miles on the show.
yeah, yeah, Miles is amazing. There was just a lot of I progressed and succeeded in life dialectically. It was two steps forward, one step back. It wasn't like there was a turn on the light switch and I now see the world differently and now I can navigate it. I feel like the lights are pretty bright these days, but they've slowly dimmed over the last 20. They've slowly gotten brighter over the last 20 years.
Along during that time leading up to a million miles in 1,000 years, which I have some specific, questions down that road. But you wrote about To Own a Dragon, reflections on growing up without a father. Did that become a specific muse for a certain reason, or it was just a part of your own coming of age, dealing with finding yourself? Back to that.
It was part of finding myself. It was part of figuring out who I am, was writing that book. And I had for years sort of, marinated on the idea that dad left. And that's a lot of what's quote unquote wrong with me.
Back to the
Uh,
victim mentality you
Back to the
talked about.
victim
Yeah.
mentality. Yeah. And so, which there's some truth to that. Dad did leave, and that's probably a lot of what's wrong with me. Uh, After meeting him when I was in my mid 30s, I realized that I probably had a better life because he wasn't in my life. Not because he was a bad guy, but just because um, he just wasn't, he wasn't the person I wanted to become. And so I spent a good year to 2 years writing that book and really trying to figure out what were the issues in my life that need work. And that was a big part of that. Even though I probably wrote the book from a voice of I've figured it out, the truth is more that I was figuring it out.
Yeah.
And that was a really healing book. It was not a commercial. It's a book that the publisher did not want. They did not think it would be commercially successful. It ended up not being commercially successful. It didn't sell copies like Blue Like Jazz or any of those books, but it was a really important part of my healing. And now, when you say, Don, or if you were to say, do you still feel like that fatherless kid sometimes? My answer is honestly no. I really don't. I don't. It would be hard for me to identify what's missing in my life because I grew up without a dad, and that I think is a testament to the fact that therapy works, and if you actually do your work, you get better. There's a lot of people who are like, "Gosh, I wish I missed the Blue Like Jazz Don. I missed the father fiction Don. I missed the Don who would kind of stare in his belly button, pull the lint out, and hold it up to the light." And my answer to that is, well, that was a real that Don created this Don, right? That Don created a capitalist who could run a company and have a successful marriage and not cry himself to sleep hardly ever, and really have an optimistic view of life. If we do our work, it should create a better person. And so now I write business books because I don't have a whole lot of self exploration uh, to go. And you say, well, shouldn't that never end? It probably should never end. But you write 7 memoirs, and you've just done a hell of a lot of it. You've done more
Yeah.
self exploration than any 10 people that you meet.
Which, yeah, I've benefited from. That's why you're here. And I think this is probably the 4th time I've had you on a podcast now. So a million miles in 1,000 years. And I keep mentioning that. So grateful for that book. It hit me at a great time of life where I realized it was really confirming for me about where I was and what I'd been doing. And I was leading a large group of people. So I bought cases of those books. So I paid, maybe a month's a mortgage for you,
Oh,
depending on where you lived. But I bought it and I gave those to new members of this group. It was people who wanted to pursue self-employment who were
Hmm.
in traditional employment, but they wanted a life change. The point was they wanted to pursue something they cared about, maybe freedom and autonomy in their life. It was all personal. And we gave out that book. And, in that, so here you are, you've accomplished a lot at the point of time when you wrote the book. And yet a premise, and I'm going to badly paraphrase it probably, but you realize you spent a year of your life and the culmination of it was buying, was it a car? The Volvo, was that, do I have that right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, yeah. The whole idea was, um, it, your life is telling a story.
Mm.
A lot of us are telling a story about saving enough money to buy a Volvo, which if you made if you made a movie out of that, would not be a very interesting movie. So a lot of us are having the experience that life isn't very interesting, but the reality is we haven't done anything interesting with it.
Well, and it to me harkened to the man in the arena quote by
Right.
uh heck, I forgot who wrote that.
I can't remember who wrote.
I can't either.
I always attribute it to Churchill, but it wasn't Churchill.
Let's
I
go
don't
with
think.
that, Roosevelt, somebody like that. But the man in the
Yeah.
arena of actually participating in life and not spectating in that. And that, yeah. So in that, when you wrote that, it was obviously a big revelation for you. You changed your life in a lot of ways and publicly exposed that journey. My kids read it. My wife read it to my kids over a summer. And I think one of my kids did a little project in school on that, but it was the concept of living a good life. What does that make? And back to movies, your depiction of who is the script writer that you did
Steve Taylor.
okay. So profound in what makes a good story and extrapolating that back.
Oh yeah, you're probably talking about Robert McKee.
There you go. Thank
Yeah, I
you.
went to a Robert McKee seminar
That was it.
and learned a lot.
To me, it was it was a very evergreen book just
Mm.
in that. I mean, when you look at that, granted, it was your memoir, something that maybe you feel, well, I'll ask that. Do you feel like okay, that existed, you went past, because I could still look at that book and go, man, I want every kid to read it uh,
Yeah.
as they go into high school, college, and think about what is the trajectory, especially in today's day and age when we know statistically we have more and more people, well, bottom line, spectating life as
Right.
opposed to
Right. Yeah.
participating. That book, yeah, do you still look at that as kind of an evergreen message?
I think that book was the initial uh, foundational way of thinking that would set up the next 25 years,
Hmm.
um, which I haven't even come to the end of that yet. But that book, the whole idea was, you can orchestrate your life and live it in such a way that it tells a great story and enjoy the experience of that. And that story has certain structure that it can really help you understand how to live a better life. For instance, a hero has a specific goal in mind. A hero is willing to overcome conflict. A hero, those kinds of things, that turned into uh, the storyline, a conference that I did for years, and a life plan that I created, that then evolved into a marketing framework that I've built a company on. And now I'm actually working on a book called Hero on a Mission, which is basically a million miles in 1,000 years, 10 years later. And much more sort of prescriptive, if you will. And that book, I finished the rough draft. It'll be out in January of next year. So I've never, once I discovered that you can live a better story if you structure your life in such a way that then use tips, if you will, from screenwriters and storytellers to do so, and enjoy the meaning of that experience. That's a foundational underpinning, if you will, for everything important that I've worked on since.
Yeah.
So that would be the beginning. That book would be the beginning of that. That's me working through those ideas.
I attended that first storyline conference.
Oh wow! In the Armory Theater in Portland,
Uh-huh.
Oregon. Oh yeah.
Uh-huh. Met my dad there, my brother, my
Oh
uncle.
cool.
And
Wow.
again, because it was so profound and so relevant to what I was doing at the time in really helping lead people to that story, but just motivated me. Again, it's been a part of my parenting as far as a muse in regards to what are we working ourselves, toward. And you went from that. I mean, the next book that was impacting me was Scary Close and
Yeah.
relationally. And
Yeah.
I think I told you this last time I had you on. My kids kind of pushed that book towards me, uh,
Huh.
and said, "Dad, you need to read this because it's so again relevant to my own relational issues." I've been married. I'm coming up on 29 years now.
Wow. Congrats.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. Except for the fact that I'm still have been so it's been a struggle. What
Yeah,
you
sure.
depicted in Scary Close. I think it was frustrating to read it, to
Hmm.
realize that here I am this far in, still dealing with this. Not to look just on the negative side, so many blessings for my marriage and my kids, but to realize that my gosh, here I'm reading this 25 years into my marriage, and uh, you imparted a lot in that. And again, I'll ask that. I like that word impart. When you look at that, I mean, when you look at any message, what do you want to impart? When you looked at that one, was it again just part of your own journey you wanted to share, or was there that thought of, my gosh, man, you see those threads that you were going through, the things that you were dealing with, you see it in other people, and here's what you have to offer. Here's some
Yeah.
insight.
Yeah. I think that book specifically, I had had such a checkered past with my dating relationships,
Yeah.
and and even so much so that they're embarrassing, to think about the time that some of these young women wasted with me, and the work I had to do to become somebody who was healthy enough to be in a stable, life-giving relationship. A little, we always have mixed motives, right? And so
Hmm.
part of my motive was to help the reader learn from mistakes that I'd made, and the other part was to convince myself and perhaps a few others that I'd done my work and was worthy of being in a good relationship. And so those mixed motives, all there's always mixed motives when you write a book, and those were some of my mixed motives going into Scary Close.
You mentioned, and I'd actually, just in looking at stuff you're doing recently, saw some people who gave you what I'm sure they felt was some constructive criticism. They'd like more of those memoirs, which
Yeah.
I got to admit, I wouldn't be upset if you came out with one as well. But in the same pressure, I'm sure you've got to have had pressure along the way, or maybe now, to be more of what the church thinks is evangelical.
Right.
Don, aren't you, what are you doing to promote God at this
Yeah.
point instead of just business? What's happening with that
I think
tension?
that, yeah, I think that's very rare these days. I think they've sort of let me go.
Okay.
And
Okay.
even though my wife and I still pray to Jesus, I still consider myself a follower of Jesus. Like hardly anything has changed in my theology in the last 20 years, except that I'm much more willing to say, um, I know the difference between what I believe and what we can prove.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of evangelicals have trouble differentiating between what they believe and what is, you know, scientifically verifiable. And that's where I kind of differ. Where even some of my theologian friends will say something, and I say, right, but that's what you believe. You actually don't know that, and that's where they go, "What? No, no, I do know." And I go, "No, no, actually, you don't know. That's what
Yeah.
you believe." And that's where I think that's the only thing that's changed in my theology is I'm willing to say, "Look, I pray to Jesus, even though I can't remotely prove that he exists and that the Bible speaks to a lot of mystery." So, but also, the real truth is, I wrote a lot of the next book will be much more memoir-esque than anything I've written in the last 7 or 8 years. I mean, it is Hero on a Mission, has a lot of the personal stories in it. Um, as for theologically, though, I debated that stuff I attended seminary classes. I studied under John Sailhammer, who wrote the Pentateuch's narrative. I spent years deep, neck deep in theology, and I'm grateful for it. But looking back, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. It
Hmm.
just wasn't, because I'm somebody who wants to figure out the puzzle. And at the end of the day, there's missing pieces to this puzzle.
Yeah.
And I'm just absolutely convinced that God has not given us those pieces, because our brains are simply not capable of understanding them. And that's where a lot of theologians would say, no, we can I mean, like R.C. Sproul or somebody would say, no, we can understand everything, all of it. There is no mystery. We have complete control. And I'm just going, there's no question the Bible doesn't answer. To me, that just seems absurd. And so I can't really hang out in that group and have those conversations. They don't, it just doesn't resonate for me.
It's reeks of ignorance and arrogance, I think, combined.
Yeah, it's both. It reeks of fear because, if I can't really understand, what they don't want is an unpredictable God. And I going, you know what? I think he's really darn unpredictable. You know what I mean? Not erratic, but unpredictable. And that's what they don't want. That scares the heck out of them. So they've got to jump through all sorts of theological.
What's interesting, you played with the word belief there, because I've got adult kids now, and I've got 2 middle school boys, and they've got their BS meter is so high. And to talk about faith, religion, spirituality. And they've helped me really come to a point of trying to not say what I believe in something that's, I want to say this is it. And so, and maybe some of it's semantics, but I found myself coming to, guys, to the best that I can, the best I can figure out today, this is what I've chosen to put my faith in. Or even to the point of, I can't not have faith in Jesus Christ. I just can't get myself I can't get myself not to believe in, or not to have faith in evil. But do I believe in it from a proven black and white? No, I'd love to, man. I'd love to have my manna stored up forever, but for some reason he only gave it to him for a day. And the next day they had to look to him and go, man, we're going to get something today. Yeah. And so faith and belief is so, I'm tracking there with you. I mean, I asked you in the last show, now that you have left the memoirs in essence, as far as what we know, and gone into business. And I said, why? Tell me a little bit more about that, about your devotion. Maybe I don't know if that's the word you would use, but having that as your focal point. You get up right now and you are devoting yourself to business, which I could see a lot of people from this deep well of humanity that you've been speaking from in memoirs and faith and whatever. Now you're speaking to business.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, 7 memoirs later, there just wasn't a whole lot more lint in the belly button to pull out and hold up to the light, right? I really felt kind of, if they said come back with another memoir, I really just thought I just don't have anything else. I've squeezed every bit of juice I can out of my own story.
Let me ask you instead of a personal development standpoint, I could see that would have made more sense to my thought process on you. And now it's over here on business. Yeah. And I'm going, I bet that there's, more so than just, it was something to do.
Yeah, no, it was extremely fulfilling to take the narrative concepts that I'd been writing about in order to figure out how to live a better life. The narrative concepts translated so efficiently into clarifying a message for a company that arguably that's the best thing I've ever done in terms of what I'll be remembered for, is the story brand framework that now 500,000 companies have used to clarify their message. So in my day job, I'm literally right now with Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, helping 51,000 real estate agents around the world double real estate sales in a down market. I'm working with Twitter to do some things. We're working with Bloomberg to do some things. It's really fulfilling work, and it works. The framework works to increase sales. And I think that may be another thing I like about it is, if somebody reads Blue Like Jazz and comes up to me and says that book really changed my life, it really helped me, it's very hard to sit down and measure how that helped you. But when we say this many real estate agents each doubled their close rate, you can just measure that. And it makes me feel very fulfilled. I will say, though, that this is not I've been doing this for about 7 years. I'll probably do it for another 5 years. And then I really think the first act was literary memoir, literary writing in a Christian spiritual sense. The second act is building a successful business. I really think the third act is some sort of political advocacy, where I take everything I've learned and go in and help uh, simplify a plan for the United States government that both Republicans and Democrats can get behind. And that all sounds so incredibly hoity-toity, but uh, that's really the thing I've been dreaming about since I was in high school. So hopefully the third act will come into play in the next 5 to 7 years.
You as a politician, or
I
you
don't believe
working?
so. No, I don't believe so. I have a little movement that we're getting started. We're working on the narrative now called "Build the Middle Class," and basically the argument is, the story, if you will, is that Republicans and Democrats have become much more interested in fighting for their own power
Sure.
and the power of their party than they have in creating practical solutions in Americans' lives. And that's costing us a couple things. One is it's costing us enormous amounts of money in taxes. I mean, what they're not talking about with the storming of the Capitol was the hundreds of millions of dollars it takes to unravel what happened, and the judicial committees that have to be created, the new security apparatuses that have to be put in place, the litigation that goes into it, all the people who are going to jail. It's just an enormous amount of wasted time. And what I want to do is with Build the Middle Class, say, look, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. If if you vote for somebody and they aren't willing to sit down and give us practical solutions on the cost of healthcare, equity in education, and a fair tax code between Wall Street and Main Street, which are those three things are what are stealing money out of middle class pocketbooks. If they're not willing to come to the table and find solutions, fire every one of them every time you go to the polls. Fire them until they get the job done. So if somebody runs for office and they're in there for 4 years or 6 years or 2 years, depending on whether they're senator, Congress, member of Congress, or a president, and they don't solve those three issues, fire them. Just get rid of them. And vote your conscience on whatever cultural issues you care about.
Mm-hmm.
But those three issues should be paramount to the quality of life. And instead, what Republicans, Democrats are doing are creating all sorts of, Republicans are just as bad as Democrats. They'll go into these rural communities, they'll talk about Jesus and guns, and then they'll take your money in the tax code, and your small towns are being shut down. It's just a con game on both sides. And we're going to call their bluff on it. And hopefully more and more political leaders will say, hey, look, we're with this Build the Middle Class platform, and you send us to DC and we're going to get that done. And hopefully it'll be a movement of the people, and I won't have to run for office at all.
When you talked about, somebody reads Blue Like Jazz or one of your books and says, man, it changed my life, as opposed to the more measurable change that you're seeing in business on this aspect of political activism, not as opposed to, but obviously we can look at the individual and trying to change the individual's life. Do you find yourself more on the, I'm going to call it, well, I had Charles Koch on the show not long ago. He's got a new book, Believe in People. And that was an outlier for me as far as his focus and what he's done, and his focus on, again, not as opposed to individuals, but his focus is on institutions.
Right.
He feels, do you find yourself more or somewhat in that direction of saying, look, if we're going to make real change, it's great. Whatever we can do for the individual, awesome. But you feel institutions are really going to make a bigger impact?
In my mind, there is no question.
Okay.
And there's no question that, the two dominant forces that shape culture are free market capitalism and government. And people come to, they'll say, well, what about the church? The church is more powerful than government. No, it is not. It is not. You can't measure eternal ramifications of things. So yes, that may be true in that case, but the government is not providing universal health care or opposing universal. I mean, the church is not doing that. The church is not creating an actual physical infrastructure in our highway systems. the church is not creating Medicare and Medicaid. The church is not creating, this church isn't doing it, no, there is no comparison. And then when you actually look at capitalism and, the fact that if you really want to change a culture, just change the incentives. The economic incentives are how you change culture. So the church can stand up and say, look, we've got to be more racially diverse. We've got to have gender diversity in the workplace. They can say that all day long. But as soon as the government steps in and says, you know what, any corporation or small business that gives 3 months of maternity leave to a woman who's having a baby, we will let you write off her salary times 2. That one move will create so much more gender equality in the workplace. So you can, this is the way I look at it. Capitalists change the world, revolutionaries get famous. And you just have to say there's a difference. And if you really, really want to change the world, I can post a lot of inspirational stuff on my Instagram feed, or I can go change the tax code. Now, I'll be called a capitalist and be made fun of and hated. But the reality is, if I go to DC and change the tax code, it's going to affect way more people's lives than if I just write a book and become famous and have a bunch of really idealistic college kids standing in line at my book signing.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask, is there one direction? All of them have, of course, huge value and significance, but one that you find yourself more drawn to when you talk about healthcare, education, economy, and what I've heard you say is it sounds like the economy, hitting that is where your impetus is?
It is, yeah, because right now, if you trade money on Wall Street, which we all do in our 401ks and all that, in a roundabout way, you pay about 11% in taxes only on what you spend. So at the end of distribution, it's about 4%. As a small business owner, I pay 39%. And they would say, well, we don't tax Wall Street because it creates so many jobs, but I create jobs too. And so really what has happened is the Wall Street money has gone into political campaigns, and both Republicans and Democrats have been bought by it. So when they say, let's make the wealthy pay their share, Wall Street, it never goes up from 11%. Mine goes up from 37 to 39. So what's happened is the majority of jobs that are created in America are created by small businesses. You know that very well. But small businesses are not being incentivized to create jobs. Large corporations are being incentivized. And ironically, what that means is large corporations grow faster than small businesses. And large corporations, they have to have a large workforce, so they move to big cities where there's an educated workforce. And that means when your kids grow up in a small town, they have to leave that small town and move to the big city to get a job. So it's shutting down America's rural communities and America's rural way of life. And to put it frankly, Republican tax beliefs and Republican tax code is shutting down rural America, moving people to the cities where ironically they become Democrats. It's just the craziest thing. So I think that has to be exposed. And I think small and medium-sized businesses who create plenty of jobs and great jobs should be incentivized just like Wall Street. All I'm asking is that Wall Street money is taxed the same as Main Street money. That's it. That's all I want. And if once America gets exposed to that, but here's what happens. Democrats run into the cities and talk about the environment and how we're all going to die. And then people get scared and they vote for them. And then they support the tax code that kills middle class. Yeah. And then Republicans go into the rural community and talk about how they're going to take your guns away, and everybody gets scared and votes for them. And then they do the same thing. And it's got to be exposed.
What's a main muse then when you look at the younger generation and look at, you got little kids that as a concern in a decade and a half, 2 decades from now that you want to primarily address?
That on the global stage, America will be relegated to middle management, and China will have taken over the economic infrastructure of the entire world, which is exactly what they're doing. They're extremely unified with Project 2025. The Communist Party, of course, using coercion, has unified that economy. They have an amazing strategic plan that involves railroads across Africa, all sorts of influence in Latin America, and buying homes in Los Angeles neighborhoods. I mean, they have bought into globalization, and the people like Donald Trump or this movement that says, look, America first, basically what's happening is the world is sitting around a table dividing up all the resources in the world. And when you say America first, you're literally saying, let's leave the table. And what that means is that our economy is going to go south really fast unless we understand how to get unified and participate in this. And if Republicans and Democrats are fighting with each other, that will never, ever happen. That is our main problem, is political theater, political drama that is drummed up so that individuals can gain personal power rather than a unified plan of people coming together and saying, let's compete. Otherwise, we're going to lose this thing.
Well, sounds like fearless leadership. I
Finally,
like it.
finally, the plaque on the wall.
It's come true, man. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for bringing us from then to now, and the motives that helps us all, I think, see and understand our own a little bit more. But always a pleasure to sit.
Well, it's an honor. It's an honor. It's incredibly generous of you to pull people's stories out of them. And it's a very healthy person that's able to do that. So I'm grateful.
Well, like you, I am a massive fan of the power of story. Don, thank you immensely.
Thank you so much.